Nobody showed up to buy America's debt. That sentence shouldn't be possible. The U.S. Treasury market is supposed to be the safest place on earth. Trillions of dollars flow through it because everyone believes the same thing. When America borrows, the world shows up. But according to the content, in a recent auction, foreign buyers didn't. The bonds were there on the screen, and no one stepped forward. Fact. The content states that U.S. 30-year Treasury bonds are no longer being bought by foreign entities. Inference. That suggests the global backstop behind U.S. debt demand may be weakening. This matters to you immediately. When a government struggles to sell debt, the pressure doesn't stay in Washington. It flows into mortgage rates, credit cards, pensions, and jobs. When debt becomes harder to sell, money becomes more expensive for everyone. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. Around 2026, roughly $10 trillion in U.S. bonds mature. When bonds mature, holders face a choice. They can roll them over and keep collecting interest, or they can say, give me my money back. That choice is manageable when buyers are plentiful. It becomes dangerous when buyers disappear. And notice what didn't happen. Yields were pushed higher to attract demand, yet the buyers still didn't come. Instead, primary dealers were forced to step in. So the real question isn't whether the U.S. has too much debt, it's what happens when the world stops volunteering to fund it. This didn't happen in isolation. Fact. The content frames this auction failure as part of a broader pattern: rising debt, accelerating maturities, and shrinking foreign participation. This isn't one bad sale. It's a repeated stress signal. Here's the framing most people miss. The U.S. doesn't just borrow a lot, it rolls its debt constantly. Old bonds mature, new bonds replace them. The entire system depends on buyers showing up every time. Fact, the content states U.S. debt is growing at roughly $1 trillion every 75 days. Fact, nearly 30% of all marketable U.S. debt is set to mature in the near term. Inference, the refinancing window is tightening at the exact moment demand is weakening. So ask the uncomfortable question. If the United States needs to refinance trillions and foreign buyers are stepping back, is this still a market or is it becoming a closed loop? Because when demand dries up, the burden doesn't vanish, it shifts inward. And that's where the story flips. Here's the claim that makes this impossible to ignore. Fact, the content says that when treasuries went unsold, primary dealers, major banks, were obligated to absorb them. This wasn't voluntary. It's how the system is designed to prevent visible failure. That sounds reassuring until you see the cost. Fact, yields rose. Higher yields mean the government had to offer more interest just to get the bonds taken. That's not confidence, that's compensation. Now notice what's missing from the public discussion. There's almost no debate about whether these banks want this debt, or whether they even have the balance sheet capacity to absorb trillions more. Fact, the content suggests as much as 80 to 90% of this maturing debt may already be held by traditional banks. Inference, that means the same institutions being forced to buy may also be the ones expecting repayment. At that point, this stops looking like a market transaction. It starts looking like debt being passed hand to hand to avoid admitting there was no buyer at all. And once you see that, the escalation becomes unavoidable. This is how pressure quietly intensifies. Historically, when Treasury auctions weaken, higher rates pull buyers back in. That's the reflex. But according to the content, this time the reflex didn't work. Inference. Either the yield no longer compensates for the risk, or the risk itself is being perceived differently. Zoom out. This isn't new behavior. When markets can't clear naturally, institutions get nudged, pressured, or required to intervene. Over time, emergency actions become routine. That's the normalization problem. Fact, the content notes that the burden of buying U.S. debt is shifting toward primary dealers and the Federal Reserve, while BRICS nations pivot toward gold. Inference, the buyer base is narrowing. A system can survive high debt if confidence is broad, but when confidence concentrates into fewer hands, every shock hits harder. This is how slow-motion crises form. Not with a crash, with repetition, unsold bonds, forced buyers, higher yields, silence. Then it happens again. And the maturities don't wait. Now watch how fast this stacks. Fact, debt is accumulating at roughly $1 trillion every 75 days. Fact, trillions in existing bonds are coming due. fact, the Reserve Bank of India alone dumped about $50 billion in treasuries to accumulate gold. At the same time, absorption shifts inward. Primary dealers, the Federal Reserve, money moving from one arm of the system to another and back again. This is the mini-crisis stack. Faster issuance, thinner demand, rising interest costs, quiet intervention. These aren't abstract trends. Bonds mature on specific dates. Interest payments don't negotiate. Auctions either clear or they don't. So the system responds with speed. More issuance, more pressure, more hidden stabilization. And that leads to the question nobody wants to answer yet. What happens if this doesn't slow down? Now bring this down to where it actually hits you. Fact. The content explains that the United States continues paying interest on everything. There's no default switch being pulled. Inference. Rising yields flow directly into real life. Mortgage rates stay higher longer than expected. Credit card interest quietly resets upward. Pension funds holding safe bonds see volatility where there wasn't any before. This isn't ideology, it's mechanics. When the government has to pay more to roll old debt, it competes for the same dollars everyone else needs. You usually feel this before you're told why. Prices rise, credit tightens, hiring slows. Then months later, someone explains it with a chart. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because most people sense system stress long before it's officially acknowledged. And that's when the story stops being about bonds and starts being about systems. Now step back and look at the mechanism. Fact, foreign buyers step away. Primary dealers are obligated to absorb debt. The Federal Reserve stands behind them. This isn't chaos, it's structure, inference. The system survives not on trust, but on incentives and pressure. Here's the unsettling insight. When markets stop disciplining debt through demand, control replaces price signals. Rates stop being discovered. They start being managed. Fact, the content mentions movement toward yield curve control, effectively capping rates. Inference, that's containment, not resolution. Extraordinary tools become routine, emergency logic becomes standard procedure, and because it's quiet, most people don't notice. Systems like this don't break suddenly. They bend, they stretch, and eventually they force a choice. Now look at where this realistically goes. Fact, the content suggests the U.S. is exploring alternative funding paths, federal land sales, a strategic Bitcoin reserve, stablecoin mechanisms, while the Fed moves toward tighter control. Inference, these are contingency tools, not signs of confidence. Two paths are forming. In one, control tightens. Rates are capped. Domestic institutions absorb more debt. Stability is maintained on the surface. In the other, confidence erodes faster than control can compensate. More intervention becomes necessary. Each fix makes the next unavoidable. And the $10 trillion wall isn't theoretical, it's dated. So the question isn't whether something happens, it's which lever gets pulled first and how often it has to be pulled. Here's the insight that reframes everything. This isn't a story about debt size, it's a story about the shift from voluntary demand to enforced stability. For decades, U.S. debt worked because people wanted it. The danger signal isn't that bonds sold, it's why they sold. Once that line is crossed, every solution becomes temporary. Every fix creates the need for another. The system doesn't collapse loudly. It gets managed quietly until it can't anymore. So when you hear that everything is fine because auctions cleared, remember the real question. Not whether the debt sold, but who was forced to buy it. Because the next chapter won't announce itself with a crash. It will arrive disguised as another intervention that suddenly feels normal. And that's exactly what we'll be watching next. If you want clear, calm analysis as these pressure points evolve, follow and subscribe. This story isn't over.